Okay, so we're going to start Perek Yud Gimel today. Hopefully finish Perek Yud Gimel today as well. Um, Up until now, we were discussing the whole concept of the En Aroch of the kelim to Or Ein Sof, and the ohros, the chayra, are yes be'erich to Or Ein Sof because the ohros all come from the kav. So there's a difference between the ohros and the kelim. The way we got into this discussion was in terms of Olam HaAtzilus. Since we have the Oris and Kelim in Atzilus, is Atzilus Ba'en Aroch to Or Ein Sof? Is it Be'erech to Or Ein Sof? We came to the conclusion that it's the Kelim that are Ba'en Aroch and the Oiros are Be'erech. In other words, the Oiros come directly from the Kav, which is Bligvul, and therefore the Or Batilus is be'erech to Or Ein Sof. It's bechinus kivuv. We had a problem with that, however, and the problem is that how the Oiros mislabshim, if the Oiros themselves are bligvul, how did they become Islam melubashim kelim? And obviously, the difficulty is that the opposite difficulty is that the inyan of bleak gvul and gvul just don't seem to go together. If the gvul is in the kelim and the bleak gvul is in the oir, how is the or melubish in the kli? We know that in Olam HaAtzilus, the or is melubish in the kli. There's oiris in kelim. And the question is, how does that possibly happen? So we discussed the possibility in the previous class that maybe the gvul in the world of Atzilus, the gvul of the kelim in the world of Atzilus, is not mamish the inyan of gvul, it's only koyach of gvul. But after discussing that for a while, we came to the conclusion that that can't possibly be. That is true in the inyan of the Reshimo, for instance, where there's no gvul mamish, where there's no limitation in literally. But in the world of Atzilus, there is limitation. The limitation in the world of Atzilus is in a number of different ways. You have Orach Chesed, it's Chesed, it's not Gvura. And furthermore, the light of the world of Atzilus does not go outside of the world of Atzilus. Only Mizgala, it's only revealed in the world of Atzilus, not outside of it. Therefore, there must be, in some sense or another, there has to be some kind of limitation in Olam HaAtzilus. So we're kind of stuck. How do we get from the bleak wool of oil to that oil, that light being clothed within the kelim, within the vessels? How does infinite clothe itself in the finite? So in the previous chapter, towards the end of the previous chapter, the suggestion was, well, perhaps the or is not in itself actually completely infinite. The or Atzilus has in it a tziyur. In other words, there are certain limitations, and we can see that from the way the or Atzilus is, the or of Chesed is Chesed, and the or of Atzilus is not mispashet, it doesn't spread out down to the world of Bria, for example, down to the lower worlds. Therefore, we must say that there is some kind of hagbola, there is some kind of limitation in the world, in the oiros themselves. And he brings various proofs and various sources in Kabbalah which explain that there are, in fact, oiros. There is his chalkus in the oiros, it's a division in the lights themselves and not just in the kelim. The sheet of the paradise, which we have been discussing up until now, was that this all the oil, all the light, is the same light, and it's only the kelim that make a difference. Only the kelim give the light any hakbala. And the typical example that the paradise uses to explain this is that the oil is like if you put water in a kli. If the kli is red, the water looks red. If the kli is blue, the water looks blue. The truth is that the water doesn't have any color, but it takes upon itself the color of the iris. However, we dispense with that idea. It can't possibly be because we have a number of Makoris in Kabbalah that say, for example, that there's esa ohros b'kli echad in the world of akudim, for example. Akudim is a very high madrega in olam. It's a high madrega in Adam Kadmon, and in the aspect of akudim, kulam akudim esa ohros b'akudim b'kli echad. There's 10 different lights in one vessel. So we see that his focus in the lights without kelim. There's only one kli, and it can be that the kli causes the division in the oil, causes the limitations in the oil. It can't possibly be. There must be, therefore, hagbola in the oils themselves, and this is what we're going to discuss further. A further proof of this in this chapter. What the conclusion is and what we draw out of this later on, we'll see in the continuation of this chapter. But in this particular continuation of the Maimon. But in this particular chapter, we're going to discuss another idea, and that's the idea of what is stated in Zohar, and the Arizal brings it and explains it also, the concept of אחליפו דוכתייהו, the exchange of places. Now, what does that mean, the exchange of places? He's going to explain it at length. I just want to preface it over here so that we get a better understanding of it. What it turns out is that you can sometimes get the or of chesed, for example, in the kli of gvura. Light that is shy to chesed comes can be manifested in the kli of gvura, and similarly the or of gvura can be manifested in the kli of chesed. אחליפו דוכתייהו, their places swap around. Now, there's a number of very interesting facts that come out of this idea, which he is going to examine, and some of them are actually quite unique chidushim. I mean, it's implicit in the idea, but it's really spelled out very clearly in the hemshech, the continuation of this particular perek. So let us look into the perek. And as usual, I will share my screen so that you can see where I'm holding. So in Perek Yud Gimel, and at the beginning of the Perek, Ulevad Kol Hanal, despite all the things that we said above, or not despite, but rather in addition to the things that we said above, Lo Yitachel Loimar, we cannot say, it's not possible to say, Damasha or Nikra or HaChesed, that the fact that the light could be called the light of Chesed, can only be after it goes into a kli. Let me just get the chat box up over here so we can see if you have any questions. Okay, so we cannot say that the or of chesed is called or chesed only when it's in the kli. We can't say that. Well, but it could be in fact the or gvura. Like that's in fact what the Ramak says. The Ramak says that the water is all the same water, and it's only the kelim that make any difference to the water. Blue clear looks blue, red clear looks red, and so on. But we are saying explicitly here that that is not the case. That can't be the case for a number of reasons that we explained in the previous chapter, and he's going to continue to explain. Another issue with that whole idea is the imkain. If that would be the case, that the or was the bechinas pshitus, it didn't have any particular tziur, didn't have any color, it didn't have any nature, it was all or pashut, simple, undifferentiated light. If that's the case, what does it mean in the Zohar when the Zohar Pashas Lech Lecha and in the Mikdash Melech is a commentary on the Zohar. The Mikdash Melech was actually a much later commentary. He came after the time of the Arizal, and he often quotes the Arizal, and he was a Talmud of the Arizal, Mikdash Melech. I think his name was Shalom Buzaglo, actually. I think that was his name. In any event. With Mikdash Melech Sham, B'Shem Arizal, he says in the name of the Arizal what it says in the Zohar. So the Arizal and the Zohar completely agree on this idea. Achlipu Duchtayu. The concept that the ohros swap their places, in the sense that Or HaChesed B'Kli HaGvura. The light of Chesed goes into the Kli of Gvura sometimes, and the light of Gvura goes into the Kli of Chesed. But if this is the case, if we have such a concept, if we acknowledge this concept of the lights swap around, So that's oir hachesed in a kli which is not the proper kli for chesed in general. How could you have that if there was not his chalkut, if there was not already differentiation within the light itself, as he explains? You couldn't call it exchange of its place. You couldn't say it's exchanging its place if it was just a simple undifferentiated light. Because it would not have any connection to chesed any more than it would have to gvura. If it's an or parshut, then there's no concept of achlifu dוכתייהו. It's either in kli chesed or kli gvura. It would make no difference. Same order. That's the Ramak Shita, and that doesn't work according to the Shita of the Zohar. And in another place it's explained in an achlifu dוכתייהו, the whole concept of achlifu dוכתייהו by way of a moshel. A very interesting moshel that is going to draw a lot of inferences out of. Al derech moshel, Shammai v'Hillel. Hillel and Shammai, as we know, are two sages who were makabel from Shmai and Avtalyon. And Hillel and Shammai represent two different drochim in Torah. Hillel represents the derech HaChesed, v'ahavta l'recha kamoicha, the whole concept of Chesed. And Shammai represents the inyan of Gvura. Milamala lamata. Chesed, Hillel, milamata lamayla. Shammai, Gvura, milamala lamata. So, al derech moshel Shammai v'Hillel, we're going to see this whole concept of achlifu dוכתייהו with Shammai and Hillel. Sheshneim kiblu merav echad. They both receive from the same Rav. They both receive from Shmai and Avtalyon. But it's not that Shmai and Avtalyon were chesed and gvura. Hillel and Shammai were chesed and gvura. Shmai and Avtalyon, even though there were zugois, there were two. Usually the zugois meant that one was the Ayin Beis din, and one was the Rosh Yeshiva. The one was the Rosh Sanhedrin, and one was the Rosh Yeshiva. That's the way it usually works with the zugois. But in any event, they both were makabel from both Shmaya and Avtalyon, and the svora that they got from Shmaya or the svora that they got from Avtalyon, they took differently. Hillel, it's not that one took from Shmaya and one took from Avtalyon. They both took from Shmaya and Avtalyon. They both learned from them. Shmaya presented a shita that Hillel took and paskened lebechinas chesed, and Shammai took the same svara from Shmaya, the same inyan from Shmaya, and he paskened legvura. Okay, this is what he's going to explain. So, svara echad that he received from their teacher, svara echad, a single svara, a single idea, a single concept. Va'afal pikein, and nevertheless, oisa v'ze matir. Shammai said it's asur, and Hillel said it's mutar. How could that be? We'll see soon. The shinui is made in a kelim, which is something that we were denying a minute ago, but we'll see how he explains this. Because Shammai was mitzad gvura. In other words, kelim was mitzad gvura. The vessels by which he understood a svara were already noitel gvura, whereas Hillel was noitel chesed. Okay, we'll see. So Shammai shaya mitzad gvura noitel isur shubechinas gvura. VeHillel shaya mitzad chesed noitel heter shubechinas chesed. About ha'oireshu hasvara, but the oir that they received, which was the svara they received, the concept that they received from their teacher, shekiblu mirabam, whether Shmai or whether Avtalyon, harishnaim kiblu svara achas, they received the same svara, the same idea, the same light, the same concept. They both received, but this one took it as gevura. He paskin lahachmir, and that one paskin lahakil. Kiblu svara achas. It changed according to the kli. Now he's going to say, this is only at first glance. Okay, this is only at first glance that's the kli that changed it, which would be according to Shittas HaRamak. But he's going to explain it according to Shittas HaRizal shortly. We'll see soon enough. But he has an interesting bracket, which we'll come back to in a minute. We'll come back to that in a minute. Let's just go after the brackets, after the parentheses. V'hinei, so when they came to their teacher and they heard the same svara again, mipi harav, from the Rav, which is the same concept as when the Rav expresses a certain idea. That's the same concept as you have the ohros coming out of the kelim of the Rav. In order to accept this or. The second time around, that's when it happened. In other words, what we're saying was, it wasn't just the kelim. Yes, it's true, the kli of Shammai was not the gvura. But how did Shammai sometimes change his svara? The second time he heard the same svara from Shmai or from Avtalion, all of a sudden he was paskin lechesed in this particular instance. How could that happen? He's kelim in the kelim of gvura. It must be that there's his chalkus in the oir. That's the point that he's making. Okay, let's just go a little bit further, you'll see. Ki hasvora shekiblu mirabam, the idea that they received from their Rav, from Shmai, from Avtalion, hirak makor hachasonim v'hagvuris, is only the makor, the source, the origin of chesed and gvura, ki etzem hasvora ena adai b'chinas chesed u'gvura, because the svora itself is not yet chesed or gvura. Okay. We'll do this parenthesis and then I'm going to go back to the other one. And therefore, because what the svara that they received is not yet chesed or gvura. What are chesed and gvura? Chesed and gvura are the midos. As we know, when we're talking about the spheros, I should have a chart of the spheros here. 1 second, let me just get it up. All right, here we go. Here we go. Okay. Everyone can see? Yeah? You can see the chart of the spheroids? Someone type a yes in there, if you can see it. Yes? No? Can everyone see the spheroids? Yes? Okay, good. All right. So, as far as Chesed and Gvura are concerned, we know that Chesed and Gvura are part of the Midos, right? These are the 6 Midos, the 6 Midos of Zeir Anpin. And one of the concepts over here is that this defines the Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, the Yesod are very defined, and they define the borders of space, so to speak. Zeir Anpin is the inyan of space, whereas Malchut is the inyan of time. Okay, so when we say that Chesed and Gvura are very clearly demarcated as this is Chesed and that's Gvura, in other words, when we define it in terms of space, we could say east and west, right? East, west, front, back, up, down. Those are the 6 sides of space, which are defined by the 6 Sfirot of Zeir Anpin from Chesed to Yesod. So Chesed and Gvura, they are therefore very clearly defined, as is the concept of Malchus, which is the passage of time. Malchus is Hashem Melech, Hashem Malach, Hashem Yimloich. Hashem Melech is king, was king, and will be king. Was, is, and will be. That's the passage of time. Yeah, was, is, and will be. But Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, etc. are the inyan of space. Okay, so what does he explain over here? So he's explaining that the svara, as it comes from Shmai and Avtalion, is not yet bechinas Chesed u'Gvura. It's still on the madrega of Moichin. And Moichin, we'll see shortly, perhaps Das, but Moichin are generally even though you have the inyan of right and left in moichin as well, the right brain and the left brain, nevertheless, in the inyan of moichin, the concept of chesed and gvura are not as well defined as they are when it comes to midos. Midos, the word midos is from the word medidos. Medidos means it's measured out and it's clear and it's precise and so on. Masha enkan in chokhmah or in bina, it's not so clear, and therefore you can have one svara coming from the bina, let's say of Shmaya, right, being given over to Hillel and Shammai takes it on one on the first pass as an instruction to pasken lechumra, but the second time he learns this Inyan with his Rav, he takes the instruction pasken lekula, leniently. So how could that be? That could be because the svara, as it is still in the seichel of the Rav, is not yet defined as being a chesed or gvura. It's not yet defined as being mutar, chesed, or asur, gvura. It's not yet defined fully. You could say, possibly, that this is like the light before it goes through a prism. Before it goes through a prism, the light is just light. There's no blue or green or red or yellow or whatever it is that you can see in the light. There's only just light. That's one color light. When you split it through the prism, then you see that there's different levels. There's red light, there's blue light, and so on and so forth. Okay. What's he going to do with this? Let's see. The sforas could change because they're on a madrega that they're not yet defined. They're coming from a level that they're not yet fully defined. They're not defined in the seichel of Shmaya or of Avtalga. In the sforas, they're ideas which are not yet applied to practical situations. They're only ideas which are don't yet have practical significance. Only in the mind of Hillel and Shammai did they gain practical significance. He continues, and as we see with our own senses, babal seichel, with someone who's a bal seichel, he accepts some kind of concept and he understands it in a certain way, he grasps it in a certain way, and when he hears it again as hasichli, this concept, he understands it in a slightly different way the next time around. It's not that previously he was mistaken about what the meaning of this concept was. He just grasps it differently. In other words, the ramifications that he thinks of in the first instance could be XYZ, but the second time he thinks about it, maybe XRP, like whatever. It's different. He comes to different conclusions. And the reason for that is because of the simplicity and the let's call it the purity of the idea of the concept. It could be understood this way, it could be understood that way. And sometimes it could be chesed, sometimes it could be gvura. Let's give an example. Let's say that the Beis Din finds somebody who is purported to have stolen something. Let's say, and you get two dayanim. The dayanim look at the facts and they look at the svara behind the facts, and the way one dayan might understand it, that Chayev is guilty. He took the thing, and we're just looking at his taking of the object. He took it; it didn't belong to him; it really belonged to somebody else, and therefore he says Chayev is guilty. Another dayan will look at the situation and will say, perhaps. Maybe it was just a mistake. He thought that it was his, and it turned out not to be his. It turned out to be someone else's. The fact is, it was somebody else's. So you could say he's guilty because it indeed was somebody else's. But he might have thought that it was, in fact, something because he had something similar, he might have thought that it was his. He didn't recognize it in the dark, or he didn't look carefully, or whatever it was, and therefore he took it until he thought it belonged to him. And therefore he's innocent, even though he took it bepoil. But nevertheless, this is the reason for him taking it, is that, not that he wanted to steal, it was b'shoigeg, he made a mistake. Right? So we can understand these two situations in completely two different ways. Right? Even though the facts are the same. Okay, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. Let's go back now to our previous bracket that we skipped. All right, so we said that both of them received the svara from the same svara from their Rav, but each of them interpreted it according to their kli. We could say it's like this. We could explain, that we could perhaps explain, as explained elsewhere, that this is the concept, this is related to the concept of what is called or ma'im rakia. There's three levels of, how should we say it? There's three states in which something could be found, right? Let's just take it in simple terminology first. Something could be a gas, it could be a liquid, or it could be a solid, right? Just simple scientific terminology. A gas, a liquid, or a solid. Which of those is the most flexible, so to speak? Obviously, a gas is the most flexible. It can move around the most, and it's the least. Gas could be compressed. It could be, etc. So it's the most flexible and the most undefined of the states to be in. Whereas a liquid, although it's more solid than a gas, it's less solid than a solid, right? So we have these three levels of gas, liquid, and solid. Similarly, in Ruchnius, in spiritual matters, you also have a similar kind of a situation called Or Ma'im Rakia. Or is the highest level of something. When it's only an aspect of illumination, it's only an aspect of undefined oil. It's pure light. On a lower level, it becomes congealed, so to speak, into the level of what would be called water. And then ultimately it becomes congealed into what's called rakia. Rakia is regarded as like ice, right? Ice. Kerach ka'en harakia. In the vision of Yechezkel on with the various malachim and so on and so forth, he sees a rakia, and rakia is a concept of ice. So we have these three things: completely fluid, which would be oil; fluid, mayim, water; rakia, ice, solid, right? So that's the paradigm. We have three possible states of being, or mayim rakia. Okay, so it's going to explain. The maya naidi, water is movable. Rakia aglidu maya, but the rakia is when the water becomes solidified, it becomes ice. The hainu, the mayim hu nekudas hachochma. Water is like the point of chochma. In other words, it is tangible, it's established, but it's nevertheless fluid. It could move this way, it could move that way. Which ice is not the case. Ice is solidified at a certain place, it's stuck there, and it's very hard to move. Right? Oil is even less so than water. In fact, the parallel that's usually given for or ma'im rakia is keser, chochma, and bina. Keser, oil, mayim, water, would be chochma, and rakia is bina. Okay, so he's going to explain a little bit further. The gimel madregas or ma'im rakia hein ba'hashef shenimshach min ha'mashpia. These three levels are ways of describing the shefa that comes from a mashpia. Mashpia is an influencer, someone who influences you, and passes on spiritual, how do you call it, outflow, spiritual flow. In other words, there's a certain dynamic that the mashpia gives over, that the Rav gives over, right? So there's three possible stages of that happening. It could be or, it could be mime, it could be rakia. Ela makabel comes from the mashpia to the makabel. The or who kamosha hashpo who adain etzem mashpia behelem. Oyer is the way it is in the Rav himself, right? There, it is not defined sufficiently to be able to place it on the Talmud. The Talmud would not know what to do with that. It's too high a level for him, right? It's too undefined for the student. He needs something he can get his hands, wrap his arms around, as they say, right? So that would be the level of Oyer, the way it is by the Mashpia himself. And water is the way it comes out of the mashpia towards the makabel, the flow out towards the makabel. And rakia is the way that the makabel grasps it, as is explained in a different maimah elsewhere. Okay, so we get these three levels. Similarly, in the sphora, in the seichel, in the intellect, in the mind of the Rav, you don't have yet, in the mind of the Rav, you don't have, he's only thinking about the concept and not the application of the concept, right? Therefore, in his mind, it's still a svara which has not yet been congealed in one direction or the other. But when it comes to his students, then there's the division already into chesed and gevura. Whether it comes from chesed or gevura, chesed hillel, gevura shammai, there we see that there's already differences, but not in the way it is in Mashpia himself. It's explained elsewhere. It could be until the very, very highest levels. It's only a paradigm. It doesn't mean that there's water there, or that there's a heaven there, or a rakia, or there's even oil there, right? It's a paradigm that we use, and we can use the same paradigm up to the very highest levels. The root of this whole concept of the Omaim Rakia would be called the Gar of Atik, the gilmeration of Atik, right? The three heads of Atik. Now, what's Atik? Atik is the Pnimius of Keser. Now, let's just go to our diagram of the spheroids. We're talking about in Keser itself, but in Keser itself, there's three levels in Keser itself. Right, there's three levels in Keser itself. There's the Chitzonis of Keser, which is called Arich. There's the Pnimius of Keser, which is called Atik. And then the Pnimius of Keser, which is called Radla, Reisha Delo Isyada. Okay, so we're talking about Atik, which is already the Pnimius of Keser. In the Pnimius of Keser, you still have two madregas. You have what's called Atika Kadisha and Atik Yoimin. Atik Yoimin is the 6 midois of Atik, and you have the Gar of Atik, the gimulation of Atik, which is Kesach Chochma Bina or Chochma Bina Dat of Atik, which is called Moichin the Atik or Atika Kadisha, the holy Atik. Okay, so then in Atik, therefore, you have the three heads in Atik itself: Chochma Bina Dat or Keta Chochma Bina. But in Kabbalah, in the Kabbalah of the Ramak and in various other places in Zohar, not so much in the Arizal, but you have it in the Arizal as well to a certain extent. But he calls them over there, says the Ramak, these are called the Gimel Reishin, the three heads of Atik. Gimel Reishin, Le Reishin, the head of the head, so to speak. Shehem Bechinas or Kadmon or Tzach or Metzuchtzach. Like or Kadmon is the highest madrega, or tzach is the next madrega, and or metuchtzach is the third, the lowest madrega. And he explains why tzach is higher than metuchtzach. But anyway, let's not get into it now. You have three heads in Atik, right? And that would be called or maim rakia up to the very highest levels. Even in Atik, you have or maim rakia, which is or kadmon, or tzach, or metuchtzach. Okay. So we went up to here. Okay, we skipped the bracket, now we finished it, and now we're over here. Olachein, and therefore, Matzinu lifamim, we find sometimes, that Beit Shammai is Mekil. Not too often, but sometimes. Why is Beit Shammai sometimes Mekil? Since they are from the side of Gvura, the Beit Shammai is always from the side of Gvura, they should have always been Makbid. They should be Machmir. How come sometimes, in some cases, they're Mekel? Because it can sometimes happen that the oil of Chesed goes into the Kliya Gvura, as we were explaining all along. Now, again, why is this important? Because we want to explain that there is, in fact, division, there is some kind of differentiation in the oil itself, not just in the Kli. According to earlier Kabbalah, was only in the kelim. The Kabbalah of the Ramak was only in the kelim that you had his chalkus. But according to the Arizal, is his chalkus even in the oil. That's important to know. We'll see why. And as we know, the 4 parashas in Tefillin, that these are the 4 levels of moichin, the 4 levels of intellect. This is actually talking about in the Tefillin Shel Rosh, that are called chub v'chug. Chochma bina, chesed gvura. Now, what do we say? We said these are called the Dalad Moichin, the 4 Moichin. So how can you have Chesed and Gvura in Moichin? Chesed and Gvura Midos are not Moichin. He asked the question himself. L'chayra Yipale. This seems to be rather surprising. How can they be counted in the Moichin? Chesed and Gvura Midos are not Moichin. Why are we counting in the Moichin over here? We said there's 4 Moichin, and they're called Chesed Chochma Bina, Chesed and Gvura. But the concept is as follows: Kanal she'achug chesed and gevura shenechshavin lemidois. Chesed and gevura only called midois. Hainu kshe'oris bekelim. When the ohros are in the kelim of chesed and gevura, then they're called midois. Shesham hem ischalkim lios chesed or gevura. That there they really divided up into chesed and gevura. There the ohros become the or of chesed or gevura. Due to the nature of the kli in which they are enclosed, in which this or becomes clothed. But the or does not have this division, this clear-cut division of chesed and gevura. Nevertheless, it does have the concept of chesed and gevura in the or. It does have the concept of differentiation, as you'll see. And as we see with the moshel that we said before of Shammai and Hillel, one is Chesed, Hillel, and one is generally Gvura, Shammai. And that's in their kelim, in the way they understand things, in the way they grasp things. Their grasp of Hillel is b'chinas Chesed. The grasp of Shammai is b'chinas Gvura. Nevertheless, we can understand shegam sechel harav haru al kopanim makor b'chinas chesed ugvura. The sechel that they receive from the Rav, for it to be able to become chesed in the moyach of Hillel or gvura in the moyach of Shammai, it must be that there was some differentiation, even though it wasn't clearly defined in the oil itself, but there must be that concept in the oil. There's chesed and gvura in a hidden way, in a hidden sense, in the kelim of Shmaya or of Talyon. But in comparison with the seichel of their talmidim, the students, Hillel and Shammai, their svara, their seichel is still the b'chinas pshitus. Now you might start arguing, and you would be right, in fact, that wait a second, isn't there an advantage in having the halacha clearly defined, right? That the halacha is generally according to Hillel, but the halacha is defined. This is the way we paskin. Yes, of course, there's that advantage, and that's the whole reason that we have the Talmud and then the Shulchan Aruch and so on and so forth, and the poskim that come after the Shulchan Aruch to clarify and bring down the halacha, so that halacha l'maaseh, we know exactly what to do. We know it's clearly and absolutely clearly defined. When it's still up in the svara of the Rav, it's not clearly defined, and that's not the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu actually wanted it to be. Yes, in order to be able to understand the root of all the sforas and so on and so forth, we have to go back to the original root of the thing, to the shoresh, and there it could be that it's not yet clearly defined. But those situations allow halacha to be somewhat flexible and not absolutely rigid, because as you know, halacha is not rigid. For example, let's say you're talking about a case of let's say keeping Shabbos, right? One of the inyonim in Shabbos, one of the halachas of Shabbos. So in a general sense, you're not allowed to, let's say, heat up water on Shabbos. There's no way you're allowed to heat up water on Shabbos. Asur, and that's it, finished. You don't heat up water on the Shabbos itself. But what happens if there's a case of a di'evid, a case where, let's say, there's a yoledes, a case that's brought in halacha, a woman that just gave birth to a baby, and she needs a hot drink, or you need hot water for bathing the baby, or whatever, that kind of thing. So if the halacha was simply that you're not allowed to do it, then there would be no possibility of warming up water for this woman or for the baby. But because there is halacha is not completely it's not completely defined and rock solid in this. There are instances where that halacha is changed. The halacha now is that it's a mitzvah to warm up the water for her. It's not an aver, it's actually a mitzvah. Mitzad brius and so on and so forth. Mitzad v'chai bahem v'lo sheyamus bahem. People have to live by them and not die by the halachas. In any event, Rakshu b'chinas pshitos lagavi tzeichu v'azongas ha'makablim shebahem ba ha'chesed gvura b'chinas yichalchus b'metzias chulu. That in the makablim, in the lower level, in the students, then it already comes into a situation of Shama is Gvura and Hillel is Chesed. More B'derech Badar Parshas the Tefillin, and as we find in the 4 Parshas of the Tefillin, Harashnei Moichin, Shnei Moichin Chog, the 2 aspects of Moichin which are called Chesed and Gvura, which again we said are usually Midois, but in this case they're called Moichin. Imi Yoisan Moichin, although there are Moichin, Harahem B'chinas Chesed Gvura al Kopanim. It's Moyach that's noitel chesed and moach that's noitel gvura. In other words, the natural tendency of this idea is towards chesed or towards gvura. We could explain it in a different way as well. It's not that this svara is noitel towards chesed automatically because that's the kind of svara that it is, or that's noitel towards gvura because that's the kind of svara it is. But it could be that we're talking about in das itself. That it could be, and that's how it's explained in many places, that the 4 parshas in Tefillin are 3 madregas of moichin, the third of which is divided into 2. So there's ches, there's chochma, and there's bina, and da'as is divided into the right side of da'as and the left side of da'as. In other words, chesed of da'as and gevura of da'as, but still moichin. So that's what he says over here. That's the tendency towards chesed or the tendency towards gvura. So it turns out, therefore, that even when you're talking about something that's in general regarded as pshitus, is regarded as simple and undivided, undifferentiated, and pshitus mamish, the or itself is not actually pshitus completely. It's not completely pshitus. It's not completely undifferentiated. And therefore you can have the concept of אחליפו דוכתייהו, the or of chesed in the kli gvura. And here we deduce 3 inyonim. And this is very, what he's bringing out over here is mamish. I haven't seen it stated anywhere else as clearly. It doesn't mean to say it isn't. I just haven't seen it that way. But he brings out 3 very, very clear directives or clear derivations from this particular concept. And important inyonim to remember. Gimel inyonim, there's three things. So what's the first one? Ha'alef, ta'oris, ta'chesed, u'gvura, she'em kelim shalahem, harem b'kenes chesed u'gvura mamash. When the or of chesed is in the kli of chesed, then it's chesed mamash. It's actually chesed in reality. When the or of gvura is in the kli of gvura, it's actually gvura b'poil mamash. Like a svara when it's in the mind of Hillel, Shama, harem b'chinas chug mamash. Then it's really chesed gvura. Ba'asogas Hillel, har svara mechayeves chesed. The idea, the svara, the concept obligates a psak din of chesed. In other words, lahakel or lahatir. And the opposite would be true. The opposite would be true in the idea of Shama, in the svara of Shama. So on that level, it's chesed gvura mamash. It's not like the moshel that the Ramak gave, that the or changes according to the kli. No, the or itself is an or of chesed. The or itself is an or of gvura in the kli of gvura. The or of chesed is an or of chesed in a kli of chesed. Right? Not like the Ramak said. Shegam ba'esh haim betoch hakli. This is what the Ramak said. Nirim lefi gavan hakli hareim pshutim be'etzem me'usam. The Ramak said the or itself is pashut. It's only the kli that makes any difference, as we've mentioned on numerous occasions. I don't think I have to belabor the point anymore. About Khan, but here we're not saying that. Khan hari asvorak shiba asogas hillel haru mechayev rak chesed v'lo gvura. It obligates chesed and not gvura. In other words, the or is an or of chesed. It obligates only chesed. It is not going to obligate gvura in the mind of Hillel. Similarly, the opposite way, in the mind of Shammai, the or ha-gvura is not going to obligate chesed. It's only going to obligate gvura. It's not only because of the kelim, but because the makor of the or, the shorish of the or, the root of the or, has both of these inyonim in it. Like chesed and gvura in svara, gabe Shammai v'Hillel, as regards Shammai and Hillel, hari svarahi, hari asibahi, mipnei shegam b'sforas harav, yesh chesed gvura behelem. Even in the mind of Shmaya and Avtalyon, you had this possibility of the words of Shema, the way the concept was understood in the mind of Shmaya, could come out like Hillel, could come out like Shammai, and something similarly for Avtalyon. In other words, chesed and gvura were over there, but bechinas helem. And even though in the soga and the grasp of Hillel or Shammai, we have chesed gvura in actuality. Telefi hasoga Shammai he bechinas gvura, al kain utovs asvara lechumra, and therefore he paskins stringently. The Hillel yos hasoga be'etzem bechinas chesed, since his hasoga is essentially chesed, al kain utovs leheter, and therefore he is more lenient, and he says mutar. Mikom makom im ba'asvara atzmo lo haya b'chul klal. And turns out, therefore, if it wouldn't be that in the root of this, in the svara root, in other words, before it was received by Hillel or by Shammai, if it would not be that there's chesed or and gvura together in the svara, you wouldn't have been able to have a Shammai and a Hillel. You would have only had or Shammai or Hillel, but not both. The very fact that you can have the same svara coming out in two completely different ways, one as Shammai and the other as Hillel, shows you that both of these things are found in the oil. Being that in the kelim they actually become chug b'poel mamash chesed gvura in actuality. The reason for that is because in the source it's chesed and gvura. You have chesed and gvura amalgamated one with the other, behelem in a hidden way. Okay, nasim b'chinas or chesed or gvura, and therefore they can become or chesed or gvura. Nevertheless, I can swap places. Excuse me. As regards Shammai, so Hillel and Shammai, even though generally their svaras are Chesed, Hillel, and Gvura Shammai, nevertheless, they can change their mind and paskin the other way. That's the first Inyan. That was the first Inyan in the oil. Okay, second Inyan. When we say that the oil of Chesed can go into the Kli of Gvura, it's not that the Kli of Gvura is coming to the oil of Chesed, but the other way around. It's the oil of Chesed coming to the Kli of Gvura. Now, this is a point that I haven't seen really explained this clearly anywhere else. But that's really the way it is. I mean, what the Rebbe Rashab is saying is that there's differentiation in the ohros, and it's the ohros that change positions, not the kelim. The kelim remain the kelim. In other words, as he's going to say, the mind of Hillel is always noited to Chesed, even though sometimes he might pass from the Gevura, but his Kli is generally the Kli of Chesed. And the Kli of the understanding and the Kli of Shammai is generally the Inyan of Gevura. And the Kli is not going to change. It's not that his mind changes suddenly, Shammai's mind changes suddenly to Chesed, or Hillel's mind changes suddenly to Gevura. No, it's the Or that changes. This is what he said. This is what he explained. The kli eno mishtane. The kli does not change. The Shammai kli of sogos b'chinas gvuras, but gabe Hillel b'chinas chesed. The kli of Shammai is gvura. Kli of chesed of Hillel is chesed. Raksha svoras mischalfim. Only the or the svora, the concept can change. Or meaning to say the analogy for the light. While a kli and a mishtani is the kli does not change. Shegam be'esha asok as for who gabe chesed, hila chesed gaba Shammai. Even though it might be chesed in this particular case, even for Shammai, mikomakom etzem kli asok as kli gvura. Nevertheless, he's asok. The way he understands things is always nevertheless kli gvura. But because of the hiskalus, the intermingling of chesed and gvura on a higher level, where chesed and gvura are in an aspect of helem, because it's a higher level of light, like the light before it goes into the prism, it's undifferentiated. So it can happen that therefore it can come out sometimes that Shammai will have a hasog of chesed. And it's known the gam chesed gvura he b'chinas gvura. When we say that each of the spheroids can be subdivided into all 10 spheroids. All the spheroids can be divided and subdivided into 10 spheroids. So let's say, for example, Chesed. Right? Chesed, you have Chochmah of Chesed, you have Das of Chesed, you have Chochmah of Chesed, Binah of Chesed, Das of Chesed, Chesed of Chesed, Gvura of Chesed. We see this by Sfiras HaOmer. When you have, during the 7 weeks, of Sfiras HaOmer, you have Chesed B'Chesed, Gvura B'Chesed, Tiferes B'Chesed, and so on and so forth. Right? Why? Because of the hiskalulus of the ohros. But nevertheless, what he wants to say is, in the week of Chesed, when you count in the week of Chesed, even if it's Gvura B'Chesed, it's nevertheless the overarching thing is Chesed. It's Gvura B'Chesed, or it's Tiferet B'Chesed. Okay, so that's what we just said over here. Oops, I closed it. So chesed b'gvura is gvura, and gvura b'chesed is chesed. So it comes out therefore that the chiluf, the change, the exchange of the oil is only in the ohros, not in the kelim. Even though the ohros themselves are chesed and gvura mamish, mikomakom. In other words, chesed in the kli of chesed would be Shammai, well, it would be Hillel generally, and gvura in the kli of gvura would be Shammai generally. Mikomakom harehem b'chinas pshitus l'gabei kelim v'yicholim yischalef. Nevertheless, on a higher level, those ohros could be exchanged around; they could be switched around. While the kelim shem b'chinas chesed gvura b'metzius, but the kelim as they are chesed gvura mamish, enam mishtanim yischalfim, they do not change. The kelim don't change; only the ohros. That's the second inference that we draw from this concept of אחליפו, דוכתייהו, that change places. V'hagimel, And the third conclusion we can draw from this is that the reason that there could be a chiluf, that there could be a change, in other words, ora chesed and kli gvura, or vice versa, is because of the seichel of the Rav. In the seichel of the Rav, chesed and gvura are behelem. Okay. And when, therefore, could it be that they could change, they could exchange? When they're receiving from the makor, from the source, now that the idea could change around. We'll see that's going to be important later on to understand in terms of changing things in our own lives. We'll see that much later on. He's going to explain. We see that in the concept in the Rav, in the Rav's mind, you have both chesed and gvur behelem. Nevertheless, compared with the makablim, it's still in a state of simple and undifferentiated. And it's only through the Talmidim that you get only in the Talmidim you get the exchange of the ohros because they're receiving it from the Rav. That this could only come about because in its source, the light is not the light of chesed or the light of gvura, it's the light of chesed and gvura in the Seichel HaRav. Davka. Davka nasa behim is chalfus. And therefore you can have exchange of the or in kli hagvura, or chesed in kli hagvura. Haresh gam yesh sheyesh b'chinas chesed gvura behelem mikom makom b'chinas pshitus. Even though you have this differentiation in a concealed way, nevertheless the or remains an or pashut. Kazu sheyachol yos mizeh is chalfus asforis. It's pashut enough that it can lead to the exchange of sforos or chesed kli hagvura. But nimtza shgam inyan pshitus bazeh enu shubchinas pshitus legamre. The pshitus is not straightforward pshitus. It's not straightforward, simple and undifferentiated. Nevertheless, it is a certain level of pshitus. אחליפו דוכתייהו, until you can have the inyan אחליפו דוכתייהו. Okay, that ends the chapter. Let's just do the kitzer. Even from this concept of אחליפו דוכתייהו, we'll understand that there's chesed and gvura in the or itself. And that's the point that we wanted to prove. We wanted to prove that there's differentiation in the light itself, even before it gets into the kelim. Well, derech moshel Shammai v'Hillel, that's like Shammai and Hillel, as we said, shekiblu sfora achas, umischalekes b'chinas chesed and gvura. They receive one sfora, divided, and because of who they were, they divided into chesed and gvura. B'kli hasogasan, in the way they grasp the idea. Kasher shoim orapam, but if they hear it again from the Rav, it could change around because of the origin of that seichel. In other words, in seichel the Rav, the chesed and gvura are not defined yet. Nevertheless, you have to say that in the mind of the Rav is the makor, the source for the chesed and gvura shalahem. Chesed and gvura shalahem hu be'etzem hasvara. The chesed and gvura is in the essence of the concept itself. It's not that they just become chesed and gvura, but in the essence of the concept itself, there's chesed and gvura. The hainu b'ha'or, mipnei she'chesed and gvura b'shebehelem hu sibas ha'chesed and gvura shebe'chalkus. There's chesed and gvura in a hidden way, and that's the reason for the chesed and gvura that comes out afterwards, b'poil b'chalkus, in proper differentiation later on in the sfiros. B'chayne ischalkus hu b'asforas. And similarly, you can have his chalfus in the idea itself, in the conceptual basis of it. You can have things switching around. Because of the simplicity of the source. So you have in the or itself, you have the concept of chesed gvura. But nevertheless, in a way of simplicity, that can give rise to the exchange of the ora chesed and kli gvura later on. Okay, any questions, Rabbi Isai? No, it's not that Shmaya and Aftani represent ohros and kelim. Someone asked, do chesed and gvura, do Shmaya and Aftani represent ohros and kelim? No, both of them had the inner ohros and kelim. In fact, Legabe, Shammai, and Hillel, Shmaya and Aftani were b'chinas ohros. They weren't b'chinas kelim. Any other questions? Okay. No questions, so we'll end it here, I guess.